Turn your Bibles to Psalm 1. Let me tell you what I want to do, if you don't mind. I want us to spend the next 13 weeks in the book of Psalms. Now, I know I cannot cover all of the book of Psalms in 13 weeks, so I'm not even going to try. What I want to do, I love the book of Psalms. This is a book of poetry. I'm not a poet. Don't really, that's not my thing. But it is such a beautiful book. It is so varied. It is so different. And I want to give a little introduction, not much, but a little introduction to this book. But this book really is a book. Someone defined it as a book that is a symphony of praise to God. And it is. There's so many different ways of looking at things, and the psalmist does this. I have preached. I haven't here, but I will preach for 2, 3, 4 sermons in a row on Psalms, and then I'll go somewhere else, and then I'll come back. And I've done that for years, and I love this book. And I've always wanted to sit down and really just sit down and digest it, chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter. And so we're going to do that. But now this is what Sellers Crane years ago started. He was going to preach through the Bible. He never made it, but he was going to preach through the Bible at Rivergate. He said, I figured that was job security because I told them they couldn't let me go till I got through. Well, I just want to go through, and we're going to take a psalm a week for 13 weeks, and then we'll go do something else, because it becomes redundant in many ways, but it's so beautiful, but yet it's still, some of the themes keep popping up. And so I want to give a short introduction tonight, and then I want us to, like I say, we'll take Psalm 1 this week, and then we'll take Psalm 2 next week, and Psalm 3, and we'll just go through and take a psalm at a time and look and see what all we can find out. We'll kind of look at the text, the context, and then make some practical applications from it. If we, well, that's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to do it. And so I hope that you'll enjoy it, and I hope that we will gain a great good out of it. Like I say, we're just going to do it for 13 weeks, and then we'll go do something else, because I don't want to bore you with it. But this is a book that is made up of songs and supplications and wisdom pieces and devotional thoughts. It has laments and it has praise. It has it all in many ways. It's a book that, from a standpoint of authors, it's no one specific author. 73 of the different Psalms are attributed to David. Now let me explain something. You'll notice not so much under Psalm 1 and 2, but you get to Psalm 3, and if you look right there under your heading of Psalm 3, probably it has, in a little different font or type, it'll say something to the effect of a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. Those are what are called superscriptions. The superscriptions are not inspired. They were added later. And so from a standpoint of are they true, we really, as a general thought, hold them to be true, but we can't say, well, this is absolute, because, like I say, they were added sometime later. But when you go through and look at the Psalms, you say, well, who wrote them? And 73 of the chapters are said to be written by David. 12 are said to be written by Asaph. 11 by the sons of Korah. 2 by Solomon. 1 by Heman. 1 by a man by the name of Ethan of Ezrahite. And 1 by Moses. That leaves 34 that are what are called by theologians orphan psalms. That just means we don't know who wrote them. We have no clue. Do we believe that they're all inspired by God? Yes. Do we believe that God has a hand in all of these from the standpoint of he gave them through by means of the Holy Spirit, inspired, just like, say, Paul wrote 1st, 2nd Timothy or 1 Corinthians? Yes. Yes. Written at different times, and that's why we really don't know the exact times they were used. We won't in the first 13 Psalms, But as you get on over into some of the Psalms, one of the things you find out is that some of the Psalms were used in some of their celebrations, their religious celebrations, that this is a Psalm that they repeated over and over. And we could talk about that when we get there, but that will be way on down the road. There is a literary structure, and I'm not going to bore you with all this, but if you ever read a book that's talking about the book of Psalms, it'll talk about the structure, and it'll talk about what's called parallelism. And parallelism is like the first line and then the second line. And there's all different kinds. There's antithetical, there's well, let me just make sure, synonymous, climatic, emblematic. I'll help you through that. And that's theologian stuff, and we don't really need that. We just need to see. But really what it is saying is depending upon, does this line, this first line, does this second line, what does it do to the first line? Does it fill it out? Does it go opposite of it? What does it do? And so we'll look at some of that stuff. It's really not that important. But there's all kinds of figures of speech. It's just a wonderful book. You know, one psalm will be a psalm of thanksgiving, and another psalm, you can read the next psalm right under it, and it'll be a psalm where the psalmist will be shaking his fist in the face of God. And you think, wow, that's bold. And it is. It is a book, though, that ultimately will, I think, strengthen your faith. It will bring you to God. And one of the things that you find in so many of the Psalms is the psalmist begins the first part of the psalm by talking about something that he doesn't like. Maybe he doubts God. Maybe he's frustrated at God because God's not listening to him. We're going to talk about Psalm 27. We're going to talk about the last couple of verses Sunday night, Lord willing, in our sermon. And when you have praying when you have problems, and look at three things that the psalmist reminds us there that we need to do when we're praying when we have problems. When you look at the Psalms, though, you find all of these things. Let's just kind of break it down. Let's just look at Psalm 1. Let's read it. It's short. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. His delights in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Do you see the contrast? The contrast is between, if you will, the righteous man, the godly man. Look in verses 1, 2, and 3. Verses 4 and 5 that talk about who? The wicked, the ungodly. And think about what he says, blessed. What do we often equate with the idea of the word blessed, especially in the New Testament? Happiness. Happiness. It's the idea of being complete. It's the idea of complete prosperity. I like what one individual wrote as I was reading and studying for this. He said, it is an exclamation of, oh, how very happy is the man who. And then, of course, this verse would fill in, the man who walks in the counsel of the ungodly. How blessed is the man, how happy is the man that walks according to the counsel of the ungodly. There are, in the book of Psalms itself, there are 26. We often call these Beatitudes. Remember the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful. Okay. Well, there are 26 of these in the book of Psalms. This is the first one. Notice that this psalm, if you stop and think about it, this psalm sets the tone for all of the psalms. Now, these psalms were written at different times. Like we think about Paul sitting down and writing, say, 1 Corinthians, or Matthew sitting down, and maybe it took him a few days, but writing the story of Jesus by inspiration, of course, but the book of Matthew. Well, this psalm written by different authors over a period of hundreds of years, with various backgrounds and backdrops and reasons for being written. But this psalm then, or then let me back up, and then the psalms were compiled. There was what in theologian terms, called a redactor. A redactor just simply means an editor. Now, my belief, the editor of the book of Psalms did not edit the text. He just chose, I believe, evidently by inspiration and by the providence of God, these are the ones we need to include. Notice, though, as he puts these together and compiles these Psalms, that the first one is talking about what God really wants, how God wants us to be. Think about what he says. This man of God, this happy is the man who walks not, nor stands in, nor sits in. The tense of the words here is interesting. It's the idea that these things were done in the past with the eye of still doing them in the present. And so the man of God does not walk in the counsel of ungodly. Not in the past, doesn't now. He doesn't stand in the paths of the sinners. He doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful, and doesn't plan to. Notice the progression of thought, if you will. Walk, stand, sit. Walk. You don't walk, what do? Well, you're standing still. You're just standing there. Well, you a lot of times say, well, let me get a load off my feet. Let me sit down. But he doesn't walk what? In the counsel of the ungodly. He doesn't walk according to the practices of those that teach false doctrine. He doesn't stand in the paths of sinners. He doesn't stand up with sinners and say, I want to be counted with them. I wanted to be counted with them. When I worked at Daltile, I've told you how wonderful the people were to me. We had a guy, though, on our team, good as gold to me and to everybody else. Great guy, really. But his mouth was foul. And when we would go in the locker room in the evening after our shift was ended in order to get our coats or change our clothes or whatever, he would start on a rant. And every other word was a cuss word, taking God's name in vain and so forth and so on. And there was another young man in there, and I'm talking about young man, probably, well, I know he was in his early 20s. And he looked at the guy once and he called his name and says, hey, man, can't you cool it? And he said, oh, no. He kept on going because, you see, some laughed at him and he thought he was cute. He was entertaining for the night. And I looked at the young boy and I said, yes. I called the man's name. I said, he's on our team and we're so proud of him. And then I, of course, made a strange face, and the boy, he understood what I was saying. But it didn't stop, sadly, this man. He was one of few, when I left the plant, it got around. Not only was I leaving, but I was leaving to go back to preaching because everybody knew I was a preacher by trade, by profession. And so he was one of the ones that came up, and you know how people will come up, oh, yeah, we're going to come see you. Now, I've heard that a million times. We'll come hear you preach. He came up to me and kind of hugged me, and he said, Paul, I could tell you I'm coming to hear you, but I'm not. He was at least honest. Well, those are the people that the psalmist says here. You don't sit. You don't sit in the seat of the scornful. Does anybody's version have something different than scornful? Wicked? Yeah. Scoffers? Some have. Yeah. Yeah. The idea of individuals that are critics, critics of the truth. So you stay away from the ungodly, you stay away from the sinners, you stay away from the critics of the truth. But he says, and we've always said, but's a contrast, but his delight's in the law. His delight, his joy. Whose joy? The righteous man. The righteous man that stays away from the sinner. His delight, his joy is in the law of the Lord. His joy is in the truth. And in that truth, he meditates. In that truth, he gives thought. And like I say, I want to come back. I want to go through the verses and kind of just pick the verses apart, and then I want to make practical application. So you might say, well, Paul, talk about this more. Well, I may in the application. But he says he spends time thinking about. Meditating there is the idea of pondering something over, giving thought to, filling one's mind with. He meditates. And he meditates day and night. But notice, here's what he does. Notice then the next kind of movement of thought. He'll be like a tree. He'll be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of the water. We think of, and oftentimes I have thought of, the idea of a tree that's just by the waters. You know, if you go down to the river, or if you go to a pond, you might see a tree that's right there by those waters, right there on the bank. But think about what it says here. Planted by the rivers of the water. It's the idea of being transplanted to that specific place. Carried to, moved to. And so he says, he shall be like a tree that's transplanted by the rivers of water. So the man of God has been moved from where he was to a place of nourishment, a place where he is fulfilled, a place where he is made stronger and better. So he's by the waters where he can get the nourishment. And notice then that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Wonderful thought, isn't it? He's the tree. He's planted by the waters. He's healthy. He's healthy, but not only is he healthy, but there is this thought that creates a little bit of problem if you stop and think about it. And he shall prosper. Does every member of the church have more than enough money to spare? No. Some of our brothers and sisters in Christ here in Nashville, in the state of Tennessee, in the United States, and especially those in around the world that are our brothers and sisters, don't have enough money. And so when the text tells us they'll prosper, we have to wonder how are you prospering? Well, here's the thought. We count prosperity based upon bank accounts, based upon dollar figures, based upon how much we have, how much is in our closet, what's sitting out in our driveway, what the size house do we have, what does it look like? But prosperity is the idea of just he's got what he needs. He's got what he needs. God's going to take care of him. The man of God is going to be taken care of by God. God's not going to leave him out and without. Now, contrast that with the ungodly. The ungodly are not so. My Bible, I was just noticing, my Bible at the end of verse 3 has a footnote, Jeremiah 17, verse 8. If you go back and look at Jeremiah 17, beginning in verse 5 and going through verse 8, it's interesting. It has very much, it's a similar thought as Psalm 1. It's flipped though. It talks about the ungodly first and then the righteous. but it's very similar in thought. But notice here in our psalm, in Psalm 1, verse 4, it says, but the ungodly, they're not like the righteous man. They're like the chaff which the wind drives away. Now think about it. Verse 3, the righteous man was transplanted by the waters. He is rooted. Chaff. What's the chaff? Chaff's the old rubbish, isn't it? When you harvest wheat, you get the husk, if you will, around the grain. And remember, you've heard tell of the chaff, that what happens, they would gather in the biblical times, they would gather the wheat and they would put it, of course, in bundles. They would carry it, and then they would carry it more to the threshing floor, and they would cut the heads of the wheat off there on the threshing floor. And then a lot of times they would stomp on them. Sometimes they wouldn't, but a lot of times they would stomp on them, not a bunch of times, just a few times. And then they would take, much like a winnowing fork or a pitchfork, and they would take this grain, these heads, and they'd throw it up in the air. And what would happen, remember when we talked about the land of Palestine, we talked about biblical backgrounds, we talked about how there's a prevailing wind there that comes off the sea, and how that when you throw that wheat up, the chaff, the husk, blows off to the side, and the wheat falls down because it's heavier. And they do this, not just once or twice. They do this all day long to blow the chaff off. And think about how that the righteous man's planted and he's prosperous, but the ungodly's like the chaff. They blow away. They're gone. There's no substance to them. There's nothing to hold them down. Therefore, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment. Sinners in the congregation of the righteous. They can't stand. They have nothing to stand on. They have nothing to stand for. They have nothing to stand with. And so their failures and their inadequacies are shown by the judgment that comes. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous. Now there's a thought for you, isn't it? The Lord knows. Does anybody's version have something different? I don't know that there's a different thought there. Watches over. Yes, thank you. I read something to that effect, and I wondered if it was in what version are you using? NIV. Okay, so maybe that's where it was connected to. It's the idea, and it really is the idea, that the Lord is watching over the righteous. There's a difference in knowing and knowing, right? Now, y'all supposed to laugh at that and say, our preacher has lost his ever-loving mind. Well, let me show you. I've been around Jay some. I know a little bit about Jay. I know what Jay does. Well, I don't really know. I know what Jay does, don't understand what Jay does. But I know a little bit about Jay. I know a little bit about his background. I've known his father for a long time, met his mama. Haven't met his sisters. And he says I don't need to. But I know a little bit about him. But I don't know Jay near as well as I know my wonderful, beautiful wife of almost 40 years. I know her. I know Jay, but I know my wife. That's the idea behind this verse. It's not the idea of knowing like I know Jay, but what Missy said, God sees us and he knows like I know my wife. And so he says, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly, they'll perish. They'll perish. And so the psalmist paints a picture for us of the righteous man and the unrighteous and the difference thereof. It sets the tone. The redactor, the editor, the compiler, whatever you want to call him, set the tone for really the whole Bible. I like what Eddie Clore is a fellow that you'll hear quite often. Eddie Clore, did you know Eddie? Eddie was at Harding, taught for a long time. Eddie is also Well, Eddie is the editor of Truth for Today commentary series. Jay's daddy wrote one of the series, wrote Ephesians, Philippians. Your dad wrote Ephesians, I believe, in that commentary series. But Eddie Clore he has written 3 volumes on Psalms, and he's trying to finish it out in 5. And it's a wonderful one. The whole set is wonderful. Some of my old teachers have written for this commentary series, and it's not technical, it's not hard, but Eddie, in his commentary on Psalm, the first one is through, I think, 32nd Psalm, something like that. But anyway, he makes a statement at the end, and I really like it with regards to this Psalm. He says, this Psalm tells people either live for God or eternally they'll wish they had. These are people that either live for God or eternally wish they had. It's a great psalm. Anything anybody like to ask before we look at some application? Sure. Anything else? Well, let me give you some general practical applications and for today. Here's my first one. It's a question. Why be righteous? Look at what the psalmist says. First of all, the psalmist says, why be righteous? Verse 1 and 2. Because that man is blessed. He's happy. There's happiness. There's happiness in being a child of God. There is a peace and a joy that is found in being a child of God. Ultimately, there is a happiness. The world can say it has happiness, and yet it's still searching. That's not to say that there are Christians, every Christian walks around with a smile on his face and a smile on his heart. No. That's, we get discouraged, we get frustrated, we get upset, we get downhearted. We looked at Elijah Sunday night. Elijah was discouraged. We get like that. We get depressed for either medical reasons or just natural reasons. That's a real part of Christian life as well. But there is a joy, there is a happiness that comes about by being God's child. And knowing that we struggle towards that idea of peace and that idea of happiness. And when you stop and think about it, it helps us to understand that there is a God. If we say, okay, we're discouraged, if we say, okay, we're downhearted, if we say, okay, we're brokenhearted, we ask ourselves, why are we this way? Well, things happen. Life happens. World happens. Very true. But while it all happens, the fact that God proves that we're trying to go back to that very idea. So therefore, God exists. You see, if the syllogism is, if God exists, then there is happiness. The idea, the what's called the antithesis, the antithetical to it is, if God does not exist, there's really no such thing as happiness. But God does exist, and there is happiness, and we're trying to get to it. And so the psalmist says, look, why be righteous? First of all, there's happiness. Second of all, there's prosperity. A life that can be enjoyed. Now, not prosperity, as we talked about already, from the standpoint of money, but prosperity from the standpoint of God blessing us, God taking care of us. And then thirdly, there's approval that such a life receives. The approval of being God's. The approval of, on the day of judgment, verse 6, the Lord knowing the way of the righteous. And thus, the way of the righteous not perishing. And so the psalmist says, here's why we need to be righteous, because of what we have and what we are. Another practical application is the idea of meditation. Remember what he said? Verse 2, his delights in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. Meditation is the idea here in the Bible. It's found quite a few times. Joshua is probably the best known of, besides maybe Psalm 1 here, where Joshua is told that here's the word of God and you're to meditate on it. Don't turn to the right or the left, but to meditate upon it. The psalmist will talk quite a few times, actually. I didn't count. I did look it up, but I didn't count the number of times that the word meditate is used in the book of Psalms. It's quite a few. It's the idea of keeping in mind. Here's the idea of meditation. Here's how to meditate upon Scripture. Meditation of Scripture is where you read, as we've just read, and you sit there in your chair or at your table or wherever you read and study your Bible. You sit there and you give thought to what you've read. You think about it. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to always be right after you've read Scripture. It can be later in the day. If you read your Scripture, say first thing in the morning, it could be later in the day you give it thought. It could be the next day. Maybe if you keep a journal and you write something down and then you go back 2 or 3 days later and you give that thought. Meditation, though, is the idea of let me think this through. Let me see both sides. Let me spend time not just reading what I've seen in Scriptures, but thinking about it, filling your heart and your mind with the Scriptures. I proposed a long time ago, I was teaching class on study the Bible. And I proposed then, this is years ago, I think, well, I have discussed it with you all before, but what I call 3 5s. That our daily devotional at least should have 3 5s. You say, preacher, that's 15 minutes. That's all right. You can give the Lord 15 minutes every day. Everybody can. 5 minutes are spent in prayer. Now, you might say, well, I want 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning, 2 or 3 minutes at the end. That's fine. But 5 minutes are spent in prayer. You spend the next 5 minutes reading the Bible, reading whatever you want to read. It might be a verse or two, but I would read at least for 5 minutes. That might be a chapter. It might be half a chapter, depending on what you're reading and even the pace with which you read. But then that third 5 is spent in meditating, thinking about what I've just read. What does this mean? What does God want me to know? What does God want me to understand? What does God want me to live? Or how does God want me to live from this passage? And so you spend, and yes, preacher, can I spend more time? Absolutely. Can you spend less? Well, I'd hope not. I'd hope you'd spend at least 15 minutes a day in thought. And so the psalmist says, his delight is the law. Now, the word law there, does anybody know what that is? It's the Hebrew word right there, is the Torah. You know what the Torah was? First 5 books, what's called the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are considered the Torah. Now, the word, this is what it meant when the Psalms were written. When you got more to the New Testament times, it was really what we would think of as the whole Old Testament. But that's all they had. And so the psalmist says he's talking, he's reading, he's meditating upon Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He's reading the law, the Torah. And he meditates on that Torah. He meditates upon that word of God. Let me give you one more that you might think strange, but I want you to walk out here this evening and say, I am a tree. I know you're going to say, yeah, well, you've proven several times in the discourse tonight that you've lost it. But think about a tree. Think about a tree from the standpoint of stability of a tree. Yes, trees are blown over from time to time. But by and large, trees grow and they grow and they grow and they're with us for years. There's a stability that can be counted on. They're always there. In the springtime, they'll come out. In the summertime, they'll give us shade. In the fall, they'll give us leaves to rake, but they'll give us beautiful color first. And then they'll be barren for a while, but then they'll come back again. There's a stability there. As a tree, you need to be stable. As a tree, we need to live a stable life. Second of all, if you think about what the psalmist said, he says, you're a tree, there's sustenance there. A tree planted by the waters, able to drink, gets its nutrients from the water, able to drink from the water that's there. As a Christian, if we meditate upon God's word, there's our source of strength. There's our source of sustenance. There's our strength that we gain. And then there's success. Notice that the tree, he brings forth fruit in season. Its leaf doesn't wither. Whatever it does, prosper. As a tree, as a child of God, God's tree, there's success. Just keep drinking in the fountain. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I see that too. Good point. Good point. I wrote myself a little note here I thought was interesting. When it talks about the last part of verse 3, whatever he does shall prosper. Eddie Clower, in his commentary, makes the idea of this prosperity is personal growth. And he talks about, as he explained his idea, his take on it, it was this. When Daniel went into the lion's den, he wouldn't necessarily say as a child of God he was prosperous. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace for their conviction and their faith, they wouldn't necessarily say, well, I'm following God, I'm prosperous. But each of these cases, there was personal growth. They grew personally. And so sometimes, as we all know, because we've been through, we've all got stories. We've all got stories, bad tales that we can tell. You don't have, as I told the group a while ago, you don't have enough time to hear my stories. But there's personal growth in those stories. And so when he says that he shall prosper there in verse 3, and whatever he does shall prosper, there's personal growth. That's a great thought. It's a great thought that Brother Clower gave us. And he'll give us some more through this series. And some other fellows will too. I've got several commentaries on Psalms that I'll be bringing in their thoughts. Anything else? Okay. So here's your assignment. Next week we will study Psalm 2. You can see it's 12 verses. It's a little longer. But notice how he begins. This is in many ways a very contemporary psalm. I'm not going to try to get political. I'm not going to be political. But it's very contemporary. It's the idea of why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing. And it's interesting. And we'll talk about it and we'll make some applications from it as well. That's your assignment. Read that, study it, think about it, meditate on it. Now you have an assignment for Wednesday nights. Here's your assignment for Sunday morning. We're starting a series. We're only going to do 13 lessons on it. I'm starting 2 series now that eventually I'll come back and add more lessons to. But read the book of Genesis for Sunday morning. You don't read it up. Read the first, let's just say read up Noah. So that's through the first 5 chapters. We're going to look at questions. We're going to look at questions, first of all, out of the Old Testament. And we'll look at the first one there. really found in the creation story. But read the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis. And I'll just tell you what I'm going to do on Sunday mornings, much like what we're going to do on Wednesday night. We're going to look at the text from a standpoint of the whole text, and then we're going to look at the context of the question itself. And we're going to look at making and spend more time on Sunday mornings making practical application about from the question itself. Any questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions? Hopefully this will be beneficial to you. I hope so. That's my intent. Let's bow forward prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the love that you have for us. We're thankful for the care that you provide for us. We're thankful for the fact that we are a family of God, that we can help those that are hurting, and we ask that you be with us, that we will help Joey as he goes through this grief with the loss of Judy, and let him know that we love him and that we care for him, and we ask that you be with him and bless him and all the children as well. We ask that you be with us as a congregation, that we'll continue to read and study your word and learn from it and be better children of yours as we continue in our study of your word and meditation upon it. Be with those that are sick, those that Jay mentioned, be with others that we know of. Touch them in a very special way and make them whole, if it be your will. We ask now that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us, that you forgive us of our sins, for this is our name. Amen.